Slides.
Okay, then we don't need to worry about that. Brilliant. Okay, so welcome everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. I'm tuning in from University College Cork, which is in Cork in the very south of Ireland. And it's worth saying in this context that I'm from Vancouver, Canada. That's my hometown. And in this context, I think it's nice to say that that Vancouver is home to a variety of Coast Salish people, but especially the Musqueam people, Squamish, Tlingit, and a few other groups, various Coast Salish people. So I really encourage people to type in, because we have a lot of people from a lot of places. Feel free to type in where you're from in the chat, especially if you know anything about the Indigenous groups of your area. That would be great to share. And more broadly, I really do encourage people to use the chat function today. So if you have thoughts, questions, responses, I really want to hear what people are thinking. Please, links, resources, whatever, please feel free to share them. Okay, so the first thing to say is a little bit about the structure. I'll post that in the chat. And we're going to have, I'm getting some feedback, so maybe someone has muted. Brilliant. So what we're going to have is I'm going to do this little intro. Then we're going to have Deborah McGregor, who's going to talk to us from York. I'll introduce her in a moment. Then we'll have a Q&A. Then we'll have Krushil Watene, who's tuning in from New Zealand very early in the morning. Thank you for that presentation, and then a Q&A. And then we'll have a little mini panel discussion, which is a chance to ask some questions about the role of Indigenous philosophy, Indigenous theory, and the practical ways that these scholars have interacted with various stakeholders, and we get to hear a little bit more about what they've been able to do. And thanks to people I see in the chat who are already sharing a little bit about where they're from. So my name is Kian Mintz-Woo. I work on climate ethics. I propose this panel. I'm really excited. I'm really pleased for everyone who's tuned in. Thanks for taking the time. I think this is a really important topic. And one thing that I just want to say to start is that there's a lot of things we don't have from being together in person, but one of the things we do have is this ability to chat, to connect from around the world. I'm in Ireland, Deborah's in Canada, Krushil's in New Zealand. That's something that, we couldn't do if we were all going to, say, Colorado or some part of the US. That would not be very easy. So I want to say that this is part of the Climate Hub series of events of the American Philosophical Association. If you're registered, please check out some of those other Climate Hub events. And a quick thing about registration. So the reason that we have this event is that this is part of the American Philosophical Association's test project for these kinds of virtual sessions. So we always have 3 sessions at the APA, and this is a test run of having one of those sessions be virtual every year. So there's one this year, one next year, and the one the year after. So whether or not you've registered this year, I want to put a quick plug in for considering registering in one of these other future virtual events. Why? Because that's sort of voting with your dollars that it is a good thing for us to have these kind of virtual APAs. And I'm going to give you 3 quick reasons why I think that you should want them. So the first is, of course, we have this ability to span space, have these very international speakers that we probably wouldn't be able to have so easily. And I think that's valuable. As a philosopher for sustainability, I think that it's more sustainable to have these kinds of events. We have less emissions, we have less all kinds of waste that's associated with all kinds of people coming all over. And then finally, I think that there's a justice component here. And the justice component is that some people can't travel. Maybe they don't have departmental funds. Maybe they've got carrying duties. Maybe they have physical disabilities that make it hard to travel. I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons why some people can't always be in person at an American Philosophical Association event. So if you're a philosopher, especially if you're a philosopher from around the world who wouldn't easily be able to get to the US, consider registering and sort of voting with your dollars that it is important to have a virtual option. So that's a quick plug for that. Okay, so enough for me. Let's start to get to our speakers. So the first speaker is going to be Deborah McGregor. Deborah McGregor is a professor at York University in Canada. She holds one of these distinguished Canada research chairs in Indigenous environmental justice. That's a really big deal as a scholar, but not only as a scholar, Deborah has had a lot of interaction with stakeholders, with the law and public policy in Canada, which I hope we get to hear a little bit of in this process. And then after Deborah speaks, and then a Q&A, we'll have Krushil Watene. Krushil is from New Zealand, associate professor at University of Auckland, which is in New Zealand. And Krushil is also involved, besides her impressive scholarship, trying to explain, apply, use various Indigenous concepts, bring them into conversation with other things, capability approaches and other things. I wanted to say that she's also involved in all kinds of high-level things. So I ran into her at a Earth Commission meeting, which is a very high-level science project where Krushil has a formal role, and I'm just a gadfly, and occasionally they let me tune in and say hi, and that was really cool. And I've seen her involved in all kinds of other things. I think the UN Development Report, something like this. So she has a UN role where she's part of an advisory committee helping support development. So I think that's just a sort of a quick taste of some of the amazing work that they both do. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Deborah. I'll break in at about 25 minutes just to say 5 minutes left. And with that, feel free to share your slides. And Deborah's talk is called An Anishinaabe Ontology of Indigenous Environmental Justice. Apologize for any mispronunciation. Yeah, that looks good. Feel free to unmute.
Sorry, when I do full screen, all my functions disappear and then I'm unable to unmute.
Oh, okay. So, is it all right to do that without seeing?
But anyway, so I've got it now. Can you see it now? Okay. Yeah, I don't know why it does that, but it did. So yeah, so again, good morning, good afternoon, very early morning, very late at night, wherever people are in that 24-hour circadian rhythm. Thank you for joining us. So I'm actually, I'm Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation. I happen to be in my First Nation, just looking out the window at the big storm that's going on. So hopefully my internet connection holds for the next couple hours. You can see I decided to change my presentation because I went, oh no, it has to be more focused on ethics. But that's you'll see where I'm going to go with this. But it's all going to come from an Anishinaabe perspective because it's kind of what I know the best. And when I examine these questions, that's sort of the perspective that I apply to the work that I'm doing. So I thought I would start off with talking about when I started to enter into the climate space. A bit kicking and screaming because a lot of my work was around water justice, First Nation water justice, and then Indigenous environmental justice. And the reality is for Indigenous folks, I guess I can speak more to the Canadian context, is just not a lot of scholars, period, let alone being involved in the Indigenous climate realm. And then I was asked to do this by First Nations. And what I was able to do was draw on the work that I did around Indigenous environmental justice. I'll just spend a minute on talking about how I decided to approach that and how I then approach it to this work that I do around Indigenous climate justice. So when I took up the position of at York University as a Canada Research Chair, all of my work up to that time was I guess Indigenous environmental justice, but I didn't frame it that way because it has its own theories and origin. It actually came from movements and then, came into the academic realm. Was always around environmental sustainability issues in relation to First Nations, how to advance Indigenous knowledge into these spaces, whether at the local, regional, or national level. And then I just sort of applied a lot of that knowledge and experience that I had gained from actually working with First Nations, not like studying them from an academic point of view, but actually working with them and actually understanding what people's concerns are and the knowledge and laws that they were applying to try to make inroads in terms of advancing their interests. And so what I realized quickly was the environmental justice space, although incredibly important, wasn't coming from that Indigenous space. It was more, this is Indigenous, or this is environmental justice. Indigenous peoples are very marginalized, vulnerable population. All these very bad things happen, which is true. but we sort of became an add-on as Indigenous people to the environmental justice conversation. So we are like an add-on. Oh, there's these distinct things about Indigenous people, like the nature of the trust or the fiduciary relationship to the crown, or our constitutional rights. So these would sort of be add-ons to the environmental justice kind of conversation. And that's fine, because I think it advanced it, but it really wasn't coming from an Indigenous point of view. It really wasn't coming from, I guess you could say, an Indigenous ontology. So so that's kind of what I worked on. What would it look like? What does an Indigenous environmental justice ontology look like? And when based on Indigenous laws and knowledge, it extended out to the natural world, who we would refer to as our relatives. So this idea of justice was always in relation to the natural world. It wasn't always so focused on the state, which is the environmental justice sort of focus, because the state's often the perpetrator in a lot of these injustices. A lot of it was focused on all our relations and how we take care of them and what those mutual sort of reciprocal obligations are. So there's a different kind of foundation. But this here, I'm going to talk about sort of how I've applied that now to the Indigenous climate justice work that I've been doing. So I just wanted to provide that bit of a background so that you kind of know where I'm coming from as I go through this presentation. And I really hope it's a half an hour. So so probably the first point that I want to make, and I always feel like I need to make this because I work in the Indigenous knowledge, language, and laws realm, is that Indigenous peoples in Turtle Island anyway, what people call now Canada, United States, Indigenous peoples were always here. We had our own knowledge systems, our own laws. We are a complete society, like any other society, and like any society, we had our own history, our own governance systems, our own way of educating, our own social systems, our own safety net, our own concepts of justice, just like any other society. And that's thousands of years old. So it's longer than any other knowledge that exists on Turtle Island. And this may be different. I know folks are from around the world, and I've been looking at the chat. So if you haven't put where you're from in the chat, put it in there, because I was enjoying reading them. And so that's really most of the knowledge that's been here. And I'm in the Great Lakes. I'm Anishinaabe from the Great Lakes. So I know most of our knowledge has been there. It's very hard to get into these broader conversations. So that's kind of my starting point. We already have knowledge about these ideas and concepts and challenges relating to sustainability. How do you then apply them to the contemporary challenges that we're facing? And then how do you even start to envision a future based on these knowledges? So I just wanted to, the center of where our knowledges come from, and actually I just came from a 3-day Anishinaabe governance meeting. The center of everything is spirit. Our understanding is that's where we come from. We're just a manifestation in the physical form of a spiritual being. That's very hard to incorporate into climate assessments, believe me. Been involved in the Canada's national climate assessments. We just finished a standalone Indigenous resilience report. And I've also been involved as a contributing author to IPCC assessments. And then next week I go to Japan to be one of the lead authors for climate and cities, sustainable something or other, United Nations IPCC assessment. So that it's very hard, and you don't see it there, but this is the center of how Anishinaabe people think about their relationships to the natural world, and the center of how we approach meeting our challenges. So if I'm centering Anishinaabe knowledge systems, language, and laws, that means also centering our stories. So for me, I work with our stories. Anishinaabe stories. And one of my favorite ones right now that I see as a climate story is the Pipe into Eagle story. Now, I don't have time in the half an hour to tell the story, but it essentially, part of the main points of the story are that humans, so what I will say is Anishinaabe people, we weren't perfect. We made mistakes. We were not always sustainable. We learned from those mistakes. And the difference for the thousands of years that we existed on the territories is that we could self-determine our own solutions. With colonization, we're not really able to do that. But for thousands of years, that's what we did. and what we can see in this particular story. So in this story, humans are not behaving properly to each other and to the natural world, and destruction is coming because of that. We keep breaking the laws, and we're not following the instructions. We're not respecting the gifts that we've been given for that guide how we're to get along. And our ultimate purpose as Anishinaabe is to support the continuance of life. That wasn't happening. So a destruction is coming. But the humans are oblivious to this. But the animals always know. The natural world always knows, and they come together to petition the creation, because I actually understand that to be a verb, to stop destruction. That we have to think about future generations. The natural world loves future generations. How do we convince creation to hold back destruction? So that future generations can learn how to live properly with the natural world and with each other. And they send the eagle to petition to creator / creation. And so the eagle does, and creation says, you have 4 days to find people who are living the proper way, conducting themselves properly in relation to each other and to the natural world, living harmoniously, respecting the traditions, continuing to do that work for the support of life. Eagle has a hard time finding anyone, but on the 4th day, the eagle is able to find a family who's still engaging in those traditions and ceremonies and respecting those natural laws. And by doing that, creator holds back destruction. So, and I'm not telling the story and giving it justice, but giving you a sense of how it kind of rolls out. So first, humans are the problem because we're not following natural law. We're not respecting all life. It's the natural world that bails us out. And a lot of our stories are like that. The natural world is generally knows what's going on way more than we do. A lot of knowledge is held there. They have agency, bails us out of this particular problem or this particular challenge. And I think in a particularly climate world that, because it can seem like this a lot of the times, is maybe leadership, political leadership at different levels isn't necessarily always on board with trying to address the climate challenges that we're dealing with. And maybe sometimes people feel like the work that they're doing isn't making a difference or doesn't matter. And I think in the story, it tells you that it does. That if there's hope, and it's based on these different set of values. So in this story, what it also tells me is there's a different set of values that matter. Our love for the earth and for future generations. You don't see this in the IPCC work at all, because I had a student look, didn't find it anywhere, that we care about future generations and that there's always hope. The broader climate change narrative is very damage-centered. Everything is like horrible. There's no, but from an Indigenous perspective or Anishinaabe perspective, there's other values that come into play that I try to have or try to account for in the work that I do by looking at our own knowledge and by looking at what our own stories tell us, even in the face of destruction, what matters. So apologies for not giving the story justice. It takes about an hour to tell properly, but just wanted to sort of give you the gist of that we have stories that guide how we can meet these challenges that we're facing. And part of what I do is try to draw on them and bring them into these broader conversations and guide some of the work that I do. I call these just a disaster report. So we already know for planetary health, the IPCC reports come out, world water reports, the IPBES reports on ecosystem and biodiversity. It's not looking good. In fact, we've already sort of reached that tipping point. So this is like the broader narrative, important narrative. I do work that contributes to these, so I'm not dismissing this at all, but we're not really getting sort of other stories and conversation as part of the broader narrative around climate justice. Now, to me, very important to acknowledge in the Indigenous context, colonialism, as I mentioned before, we used to self-determine our own solutions because we weren't perfect. And this is another reason why I think it's important to mention colonialism is right now, I'm involved in a Canada, US, Mexico climate and biodiversity assessment. And maybe about 3 weeks ago, we were told, given the directive from the US government, that we can't use the word colonialism in it. We can't use the word justice in it. There's words that we are not allowed to use in this assessment. So I just say colonialism every chance I get, because likely what will happen, the scholars after this conference, I have a meeting with the authors. We'll just publish the stuff that'll say all the things that we're banned from saying. But this will matter later in some of the comments that I'll make on this. But this acknowledgement, and it took so long to get it in as part of climate assessments and part of the climate conversation, is now, you know, being told we can't be using it. But it does matter. I think in everybody's context, like to me, colonialism is everybody's problem. It's not like an Indigenous problem. So I'm just sharing that because I feel like every chance I get, I should mention those words that are banned. So climate, I'm trying to see how much time I have. So climate crisis, I call these the other C words. When I go into the meetings, there's so much focus on carbon. And I agree that carbon is a huge problem, but it's not the only one. Like the Indigenous reality on the ground, carbon isn't the big one because we're not the ones producing it. So I think people find that that's the case with Indigenous people. We're generally confronted with colonialism every day in our everyday lived reality, capitalism, resource extraction. In Ontario, Conservative government just got elected, and that is their big push. We're going to deregulate, and we're going to just exploit mining like it's nuts. So, so this is like our reality. So we look at climate as including what I call all these other C words. That tends not to be the focus of a lot of climate conversations that I've been a part of. There's a number of assumptions. A lot of this is drawing upon the work of Kyle White. Indigenous peoples have already endured centuries of immense cultural. I'm not going to read these. We've already faced a lot of challenges, and we've been severely disrupted by colonialism and these other processes that have made us also very vulnerable. However, we've also survived. So what this means is that we've had to face our annihilation, like genocidal policies still trying to exterminate us. I was just at this governance meeting, you know, that's still the agenda, unfortunately, and people are, you know, trying to figure out how to resist this. But now with climate change, everybody's facing their annihilation. So maybe there's some things to learn from people who survived, you know, challenges in every single domain of life and well-being might have something to offer the world in terms of not only our knowledges, but also our experiences and how to go about surviving all this massive and often destructive change. So this comes from the United Nations. So what they know is that Indigenous peoples caretake about 22% of the Earth's landmass, but this is where 80% of the Earth's biodiversity is found. This is also where Indigenous languages are spoken, and so there's something about that. And I've been asked sometimes explicitly. So this is just a Canadian context. Like, what is it about that? What is that? But a lot of, really, quite frankly, a lot of climate change research hasn't been seeking to really trying to understand that question. Part of the response to this is Indigenous-led, protected, and conserved areas. I would say I haven't seen so much of language revitalization and support in communities for that, which is one of their priorities, because again, there's so much focus on sort of the carbon world, and not necessarily how do we build resilience. But from an Indigenous perspective, language revitalization work is considered a climate action and part of climate strategy and way to build our resistance and adaptation to climate change. So I'm hoping to do more research in that area. I remember being asked when we were publishing this one paper that I'm citing here, is that, can you prove that? I'm like, well, like in terms of empirical kind of evidence, there has been some research that has done that. But specifically, what is it about Indigenous languages that enables people to know and to caretake for the land? Maybe the speaker next to me has or after me has some insights into that. But I'm trying to figure out, well, how would we measure that? What does that look like? What's the empirical indicators for what that looks like? this is just, again, I usually try to make this point that when I look at the previous declarations that Indigenous peoples have put together over the decades, particularly since the Earth Summit, after the Rio de Janeiro conference in 1992, is always the stressing of our natural laws, of our knowledge, looking at it more holistically. Here you see reference to the arts and culture.
Great-great-great-great-grandfather invented a bifocal spectacle, and here's his direct descendant wearing one.
I don't know what that is. Is that like a Zoom bomb?
I don't know, but I think we've managed to mute them. So sorry about that. Please
Oh,
go ahead.
okay, okay. Yeah, so just, I always refer to them because I find that sometimes, you know, I might be on a panel for 10 minutes and I have to speak on behalf of all Indigenous people on the planet. And so I always go to the declarations over like almost the last 4 decades and see what so many hundreds of different nations of Indigenous people around the world have said about the challenges that we're facing. And they do always talk about colonialism and the impact of that, and what it is that we need to move towards in terms of solutions, our knowledge and laws, which often don't get accounted for. Like often you'll see recognition of our knowledge, but not necessarily our laws and language. But I think it's becoming more part of the conversation. It's just like most things. What do we do about that then? That people have told us this is important. So I'm not gonna read this, but this is really to me becoming something that I'm noticing more and more and more. Now I noticed this when I was engaged in the first climate assessment, was during the pandemic, that it was very hard for me to answer the questions that I was asked to write about as a contributing author because a body of work didn't exist. And then I kind of realized that, oh, it's because people were, the questions that were being asked 5 decades ago, 4 decades ago, 3 decades ago, although probably important at the time, they weren't necessarily asking the right questions. And I'm assuming everybody around this table, most people are researchers, and it's about, are we asking the right questions? So we didn't have that knowledge base. And it's very specific about what knowledge that we have to draw on in order to do these assessments. So it's really difficult to do. So a lot of this is mentioned here. The body of work that we have to work with is hugely biased right now. It's also what they found, even in terms of disciplines, is I don't refer to it here, but it was someone did this analysis and the paper was published in 2000, that most of it was relating to mitigation. Most of the research funding, they were looking at funding for mitigation, was 780% over to the natural sciences, very little in the social sciences and very little in the humanities. So again, these other values were not accounted for because they're so focused on carbon. And in terms of funding that people would get to address these challenges. So I find that there's a very much the literature that we rely on is very biased. Like that's a peer-reviewed literature. People's lived experience is very different. But people experience everyone's experiencing climate change in some way, shape, or form. And in relation to this assessment that we have to do, I see it almost like a epistemological violence, like you're just not allowed to talk about certain things that kind of matter in the conversation. So I call it an ontology of climate change. So again, I'm not going to read this. This is kind of what you find in the IPCC. Now I participate in this, so I'm not disputing that this is what climate change is. It's just not only what it is. That's how I frame it, the same way I was framing environmental justice, which is environmental justice is these things are true, but there's other things that are true that need to be accounted for. I'm trying to see. I know you're trying to discipline me here, and I'm trying to. I might be missing your chat there. It's
No,
not showing up.
seven more minutes or so.
Oh, okay. All right. So, so I want to say that this is true, but it's not the only thing that's true. There's other things that are true that we need to account for in terms of climate change in order to move towards climate justice. So again, for my work, I go back to the community. So this is a declaration that actually what this was these elders and traditional knowledge holders in Manitoba brought together actually scientists and knowledge holders from around Turtle Island, and I think maybe even some people from Central America as well, to come and talk about climate change and what do we need to do for the future. And they came out with a declaration, which you could probably Google, the Turtle Lodge Declaration, the Anishinaabe, which means our changing Earth. So again, it offers hope for the future. So for me in my work, I think about where's the hope when everything that I'm doing seems pretty darn damage-centered, harm reduction, very crisis-oriented, acknowledges the agency and leadership of the Earth, like in the story. How can nature and our relationships with the natural world help us deal with these challenges? And also, as the Earth changes, so must we. And I find that's part of like what the climate solutions are like. They're more like, let's find the techno fix. Let's just tweak things so we can continue to be kind of sustainable and not really kind of change really dramatically how we are in the world. So they're saying, no, we actually need to change. And so these are just other things that people were saying about how I'm trying to understand an Indigenous ontology of climate change. And before the pandemic, I did have this opportunity to facilitate an elder youth gathering. And this was one of the comments by one of the youth in Northern Ontario. And she said that climate change is the Earth communicating with us, telling us what we're doing to her. So all these disasters, wildfires, floods, that's all the Earth sort of saying things that we're doing are very bad and affecting people and the natural world in very negative ways. And I thought to myself, she's right. That's what it is. If you know how to listen to the Earth, if you have these connections, that's exactly what's happening. Like what's happening shouldn't be happening if humans were relating to the Earth in the proper way. So again, like in the story, it's because people are not behaving properly or conducting themselves properly. And how can we gain those skills to be able to listen to the land? Now, science has their methods, monitoring, using models to try to understand what's happening to the Earth, but the skill to be able to work with and relate to the Earth, probably not there so much that you may find among Indigenous peoples and others, because I think there are other knowledges that also matter and should be part of these conversations, as well. So what are we being told, and what other knowledge are we missing in this body of work that we tend to rely on when we're doing assessments, which then inform solutions and advocacy with the state? So this is some research that I'm involved in, that I've started to do, is how do we strengthen Indigenous ways of knowing and languages, and how do we start sharing Indigenous climate knowledge in these other spaces, because it's not there among other people's knowledge as well. So here, Anishinaabe ontology of well-being. What does this mean? For us, it means understanding our relationship with the natural world as receiving a gift. It guides our conduct for sustainable relationships. We have laws that guide this conduct, and there's immense ecological knowledge to know this. So this is specifically in this example I'll give is, so this is my family in the sugar bush, which should be opening in a few weeks from now, depending on the climate, a few kilometers down the road from where I'm sitting right now. And this particular story relates to, so my family still, you go around the trees and you gather the sap. Every year, it would be decided which trees are going to be tapped. We still have the fire. And at one point, it's actually hard work to do this. And my brothers, I have 5. They have to take time off work. You have to be in the bush all day. You have this fire. They wanted to do what people do. The student told me it's the pipeline system. They have these pipes that go from the trees that drain the sap and goes into this big building, and this a big evaporator, and it's all very techno. So my brothers were suggesting this, just because it was going to be easier than actually kind of being in the bush all the time. My father said no. And he said no because it would change the nature of the relationship with the trees and what we call the sugar bush. And so at this time of year, it is very hard to hunt. It's very hard to move in the bush. It's hard to fish because we're not sure if the ice is safe. So this was a time for us historically of great food insecurity. And so getting that sap gave you enough energy to maybe travel a bit further for a hunt, give you enough strength to be able to find food for your family. So we have a lot of stories around how maple sap came to us, or how sap came to us, and how important it was, how it often saved us in a time of great crisis. So we don't want to change that relationship. So we understand that the sap comes, it's a gift. And so he said, what would happen is what we need to do is understand that we're receiving a gift from the trees. We're receiving sap. We can do other things with it, like make syrup or make sugar from it, which can, sustain you, or we could use for trade or other purposes, as opposed to taking something. Those pipeline starts to take from the trees. So you're shifting your worldview, your ethics, your laws from receiving a gift to taking something, and that changes the nature of your relationship with the natural world, and how you understand your responsibilities and obligations to the natural world. So it's a principle.
Last couple minutes.
Okay, it's a principle of to me, of being in the world. And I am almost finished. So this is not something that it's very difficult to say, what's the checklist? I've been asked, what's the checklist for this? And I'm like, there isn't a checklist for this. It's a way of being in the world. Like when you think about this in terms of ethics, like it's a way that you are in the world. Like it's how you think about waking up every day and thinking about what your gift is going to be, as opposed to what you're going to take, is a different way of being in the world. So what does this mean in terms of some of the work that I do? How do I base the work that I do on imagining a future? Sometimes I think we lack imagination. Like if we said, you can't do a lot of the things that we take for granted in terms of taking from the earth, what would it look like? What would your day kind of look like? And this is just some art from the Youth Elders Gathering, where they brought up the idea of love. I find this Indigenous context, these other values always come up. A lot of our ability to be resilient is related to our language, relationship to the earth, and identity. Again, this was something that the youth had brought up as part of this gathering. Why our own stories matter, how we turn to the natural world for guidance. People call these nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, but it's still like a weird ontology there happening. And yeah, miigwech. So that's thank you. So I know I rushed through that, but hopefully there was some food for thought and enough there for you to ask me some questions about the work that I'm doing. So miigwech.
Amazing. Thanks so much. Thanks for all the digital claps. That's really wonderful. I mean, we do what we can in these funny online spaces. So thanks for that. Brilliant. So we've got time for questions, and then we'll go to Krushil. So please use the Zoom raise hand. So that's usually under React raise hands, and I will try to keep track of the participants. Let's see. Yeah, no hands yet. So feel free to raise your hand if you've got a question for Deborah McGregor. Great. It looks like the first one is Ian Byrne. Feel free to unmute and ask your question. And then Simona.
I was curious about like the specific work that you've been doing.
You mean like the research projects that I'm working on?
Yeah, I joined like a little bit late because of class, so.
Oh, okay. Well, there's multiple projects that I'm involved in. So the image that I showed was what I'm calling right now we're just calling it the 13 Moon Project, and it's part of a broader research project that I'm involved in what is a climate future look like? What does an Indigenous climate future look like? And because I'm involved in these other assessments, and I feel like there's quite a bit of knowledge missing in order to really bring that story forward, that I decided that Indigenous peoples always had their own ways of assessing. Like we had to do that all the time in order to survive. So we had our own ways of assessing how things were going. So what I'm doing right now is assessing based on the 13 moon system. So it's 1 moon, 13 moons. When I would go into these climate spaces, I'd always be told that we can't really assess like how climate is impacting you because we don't have the baseline. That's always what I'm told. And I'd be like, but we do. Like we know exactly what's supposed to be happening. And then one of the ways that we do that is through the 13 moon system. So during every full moon, we have stories about what should be happening during that time. There's a lot of ecological knowledge in those stories, including the maple sap stories that I talked about. There's a number of different ones. They have different ecological knowledge within them about how to survive, where to get food. So we have them around each one of the 13 moons. So I see that as our baseline. What should be happening during those times that come from our stories, multiple stories, and then what's actually happening. So that's our baseline. And what do we actually see happening during, let's say, the February, the bear moon. So each of them have different names. They're going to be different depending on where you are, but people have these stories that give you that baseline. This is what should be happening at this time. You have the ecological knowledge embedded within those stories, because to do anything land-based, you have to have ecological knowledge. And then what's actually happening now. So that's one way of assessing change. So that's something that I'm working on one of the things that I'm working on right now. The other is, what are the indicators of well-being? So again, I'm trying to orient the work that I'm doing to respond to the calls that I'm getting from, Anishinaabe and First Nations and Anishinaabe people that I'm working with, which is we can't just focus on how horrible everything is, because a lot of First Nations are dealing with multiple crises all the time. And so what does well-being kind of look like to us? So I find that in the literature review that we've done, there's a lot of literature on generally deficit indicators for Indigenous people relating to health, like everything, like every indicator of kind of like well-being, the opposite is true for Indigenous peoples, where in Canada, they call it closing the gap. We're like 10 years behind everybody else in terms of health. So a lot in health, particularly mental health, and but not a lot in what does that relationship look like to the land? So how then can what's my evidence? What are going to be the indicators for how I measure how language enables, for lack of a better word, conservation of biological diversity or ecosystems, right? Like this is the kind of thing people are kind of asking, because in these scientific assessments, that's the kind of evidence that they want. So again, as part of this work how do I bring Indigenous climate knowledge into these spaces that already exist in Indigenous communities, but these other spaces are trying to understand and trying to incorporate Indigenous knowledges, don't have a clue how right now. Anyway, so those are two of them that are one that I'm been working on for a few years, because part of my approach to that was I needed to experience it myself. So I would come up north, go to the same place during the full moon, and see what was happening and what should be happening according to our stories, and talking to people about, 70 years ago, what was it like when we would open the bush and when we would close it, kind of thing. So it actually becomes part of your, for me, my everyday reality. So the knowledge that I'm bringing to these spaces is actually based on my actual experience. It's not just something I read somewhere. I think that's another important part of this, important part of this as well. So good question. Hopefully that gave you some insights. So those are some of the challenges in the work that I'm engaged in right now. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. So, I'm going to go to a watch party in Bridgewater College. Please feel free to unmute and go ahead.
Hi, I'm not sure if you guys can hear us because we're in a big classroom. Are you guys good? Okay, cool. One, thank you for, again, sharing with us your experiences and such like that. I guess I'm kind of representing our class in Bridgewater, Virginia. So yeah. But I don't know if others had this question, but I was curious. I really appreciate your idea as seeing natural resources as a gift. But with your work on the international scale, I'm curious to see how your perspective on this either comes into conflict with others that you might work with from different areas of the world, or how it might be successful. Yeah, so thank you.
I suspect that with Indigenous peoples, that's not going to be an unusual concept, based on kind of what I'm familiar with. Again, by looking at the different Indigenous declarations, looking at understanding our relationship to the natural worlds, that is going to require work. So even though I can sit here and I suppose academically be a bit critical of how the ecosystems initiative kind of ecosystem services approach, or the nature-based solutions kind of approach, those do, because they are pointing to nature. Nature's going to help us. Like, we got to plant more trees and conserve, and it's not just, technology to reduce emissions coming out of a pipe somewhere, or some smokestack or whatever. So I think that kind of orientation provides that kind of opening, provides that kind of opportunity to bring other perspectives in there. So it will be a challenge, because fundamentally you have a different, I guess, worldview and ontology and way of understanding those relationships. So I see that I often, or for me personally or professionally, I experience that often as a tension. Is people, so now there's a bit of a narrative around Indigenous climate leadership. What can we bring to the table? And so there's interest in it, but sometimes it's really hard, I find, for people to kind of wrap their head around that kind of ontology. And one of the ways that I find that they sometimes can is when they step out of that hat of whatever it is, whatever hat they're having in the meeting, and go personal, like, why do they care? Why do we care about a climate future? Why do we care about future generations? They find often in their personal lives, like why they like nature, how they grew up, the values that they learned from their family. Sometimes that's kind of where it shows up, where people sort of can relate to these concepts because it's part of their lived experience, and how they actually might be teaching their own, children. So that's kind of what I've found over time. But the nature, I think, of academia is that we're asked to separate those. But when people go to those, they're like, oh, I can kind of relate to that in some way. So I find that there's openings now for how you can kind of have those kind of conversations. Yeah, big right now, I guess, especially for this assessment we're doing with the continental assessment, with biodiversity, is very much the ecosystem services concept is very dominant. And I get it, but that's still not an Indigenous kind of ontology, but it gives you an opening. We can have a conversation because we've got some common ground there. So I think that's one of the ways to approach that. Yeah. So thank you for the question.
So that's really great. So I'm going to let one more question, maybe quickly in a minute or two, hopefully a question back and forth, and then we'll go over to Krushil. So Colin Madison, feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering how your work relates to the recognition and actualization of broken treaties and the land back movement. If you feel that there's a connection of infusing Indigenous knowledge within the land back movement.
Yes, there is. So that's part of the big, I guess I would put that, I had the big concept of colonialism, but that's part of the impacts of colonialism is not respecting the treaties, often very deliberate, deliberate in order for resource extraction and whatever else. And land back, part of not recognizing the effort by Indigenous peoples to gain their lands back. Because the fundamental, like when I'm talking about land-based activities, language activities, even protecting biodiversity, or that graph that I showed you, or the bar chart that I showed you, you can't really do that unless you're on your land. Like you need to be on that land. You need to be able to engage in these kind of activities. So I find that is it's huge. That's a big part of it. So Treaties is a big part of that. Self-determination is a big part of that. Self-government is a big part of that. Indigenous laws is a big part of that. And I'll just end with, or to answer your question, is kind of where that, I wouldn't say blew up in my face, where it became really obvious, is that when I was talking about that youth elders gathering that I facilitated, there was these folks that came from the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Ontario. Under the Ford government, there is no more Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change, gone, no climate strategy. But at the time there was, and they were helping to fund this. And I noticed that all their solutions for climate change, I guess, First Nations adaptation or resilience, was they would throw out things like, you really need to have community gardens. And I'm not against community gardens. I benefit from the community gardens in my community. But then I started to notice that almost everything that they were proposing was meant to keep us off the land. Like they didn't want us on the traditional territories hunting and gathering. They didn't want us there. Everything was like they were funding stuff that was just going to keep us on the reserve in a particular place. And the youth and elders kept saying, no, we want to learn how to hunt moose. We want to be able to gather medicines out there on the land. We want to be able to drink the water. So they have very different ideas of what the solutions were. And then I was sitting there going, oh, they're trying to keep us off the land. Whereas Indigenous people are, we need to be on the land, having these relationships and reestablishing these relations to the land. So no, it's very deliberate to keep Indigenous peoples off the land and undermine those relationships because they need the land right now for resource development, extraction, and whatever else. But so no, that's pretty central. Is pretty central to these conversations. And I probably could have explained it more, but it's under this my thing called colonialism and all the things that come with that. So hopefully that kind of answers your question. So good question, and I appreciate you asking and forcing me to talk more about that.
Amazing. Yeah, no, I'm also glad that you asked that question and that we took that time to do that. And I put a link in the chat to a CBC News item about Doug Ford in case people who are not Canadian are not familiar with this situation and you want to know.
That election was yesterday. Woke up to that this morning, right. So that's why it's on my mind.
Very new news for us Canadians. Great. So first of all, I want to say thanks, everyone. I also want to give a quick shout out to Monica. I saw gave a heart. Thanks for your interactions. I appreciate that, and I'm sure others do. So for this, I'm about to welcome Krushil, and Krushil does not have slides. So I propose that people, if you're able to, please turn your camera on, because then we can see each other a little bit more and maybe have a little bit more community while Krushil talks. And with that, please take it away.
Ngā mihi mai oha kia koutou I tēnei hui, he uri no Ngāti Manu, Te Hikatu, Ngāti Whātua, Ōrākei me Tonga. So kia ora from New Zealand to all the places that we're dialing in from. So I'm dialing in from Tāmaki or Auckland in New Zealand, which is where my tribal community of Ngāti Whātua, Ōrākei is located. If you're familiar with New Zealand, my communities are from the north. So the region called Taitokero, which is everything including Auckland, all the way up to the top of the North Island. So that includes the Bay of Islands, which is on the east coast, and also a place called Hokianga, which is on the west. And I also have wider Pasifika connections to the Vava'u group of islands, which is in Tonga. Thanks so much for organising the session. It's so great to be here. I've learnt a lot from reading your work, Deborah, so for a long time. So it's great to be here with you and with you all. So I'm going to do three things. First, I'm going to draw out some key Māori ideas and wider Pacific philosophical ideas from a couple of short stories. Deborah explained exactly why we do that, why we ground our philosophies and our stories. And then I want to try and situate the notion of Kaitiakitanga, which translates roughly as stewardship or trusteeship in English, amongst those ideas. And then I'm going to end with some of what I think Kaitiakitanga relies on today, what stewardship or trusteeship relies on today, and so some of the things that it can teach us. Alrighty, so here's the first story. So a well-known northern Māori, or Ngāpuhi, is the area or the region that we talk about when we talk about the north. So a well-known proverb from the north speaks to the intimate relationships that there are between the east and west coasts of the far north. So further than Auckland, for instance, to the tides there, to the waterways. And the proverb tells of the way, it's a really old proverb, it tells of the way that when the fountain, for instance, at a place called Taumarere, which is one of the places I'm from, on the east coast is empty, that the fountain at the Hokianga on the west is overflowing. And so that when the fountain at Taumarere overflows, the fountain at the Hokianga on the other side is empty. And so this proverb, which we talk about a lot in the north, reminds us of a whole range of things. And one of the things that reminds us is the way in which what happens to one of our communities, to one part of the landscape, affects the other. That the destinies of the lands and the waterways, of the people and the communities there, will always be intertwined, right? That there's some kind of responsibility that we have to each other because of the way in which we're connected. Here's the second story. So for the people of Ngāti Manu, and that's another tribal community that I belong to, we take our name from our ancestors' epic journey to see their grandchild one last time. A journey that we talk about as being both about struggle and hope. And so our name Ngāti Manu, celebrates the strength and the courage to pursue something that's valuable, even in the face of great risk and failure. That's because our ancestor never makes it to see his granddaughter one last time. They die of exhaustion instead on a little beach not too far away from where they're located. But we honor that journey, and we remember it by remembering key moments when birds come to our ancestors' aid. And so their grandchild's descendants, the people of Ngāti Manu, we took that name, which literally means the people of the birds, to remember that, right? To remember the relationship that we have with the natural environment, with birds, with ancestors, and with future generations. And so these stories help us to unpack a number of key ideas that are central to Māori and other Pacific philosophies. First, they help us to see that relationships play a really big part in the moral and political fabric of Māori communities and of Māori philosophies. And that these relationships are widely inclusive and woven in complex kinship networks, right? And so they include relationships between human beings and human communities, and that they stretch across diverse and multiple relatives with animals, flora and fauna, and natural entities too, such as land and waterways and entire ecosystems. And we see that these relationships are multi-generational as well, including our ancestors, our present generations, and those yet to be born. They also help us to understand the way that these relationships between people and places and more than human entities generate responsibilities of caretaking and guardianship. And that's because when we have intimate connections to and knowledge of each other, both human and non-human, we generate responsibilities and commitments. These relationships orient us, right? They ground our values and our commitments and our practices and our actions. And they rely on things like mutual respect and reciprocity. And that's because they involve recognition of those in the relationship as deserving of consideration and concern. So that each part of the complex network of relationships has, to use a Māori term, has mana in its own right, its own dignity, its own place, its own purpose. Right? And this influences how we treat each other and builds trust in our commitments to each other too, through those practices. And they also rely on and require mutual caretaking, right? Mutual respect and shared responsibility taking and a recognition of that. Part of what it means to live well, then, is to live in ways that honor and respect our relationships. And this requires a commitment to pursuing well-being in these mutually beneficial ways. And it builds from a commitment that recognizes that when we fail to pursue well-being in mutually beneficial ways, that we not only fail each other, this wide, complex network of relationships, but we fail ourselves, that we undermine our own dignity when we fail to acknowledge the dignity of others. And it recognizes that our well-being is intimately bound up with the well-being of other parts of that network, human beings, non-human relatives, and the natural environment too. So within these and other narratives, we can begin to recognize and understand some of the content of Māori philosophy and other Pacific philosophies, some key ideas, and how they evolve and so on, and their place within the system. But I think there's more to say about this, actually, and there's more to highlight about what these stories help to show us. And that's that the environment also provides, the natural environment also provides the starting point for practices of philosophical inquiry, not just the content, but the practice itself of philosophical inquiry. And we see this, for instance, in the importance of land and in whenua, which is what we call it in New Zealand, not just as something that contains philosophical content, but as something that should be engaged in and that inspires philosophical thought, right? Critical engagement, a starting point for that kind of engagement. Similarly, we see this that for many Pacific Island scholars, our intimate relationships with the Pacific Ocean provides a way to retain and reclaim our identities, our unique thought processes, and even a form of agency, right? So for people like Epeli Hauofa, a wonderful Tongan scholar, talks about the ocean as carrying our stories, as connecting us with each other, and as a means through which our aspirations can inspire and transform thinking, right, as well. So Māori thought and inquiry takes their their starting points from other specific natural life forms and features too, not just land and water, but plant life, non-human animals, as well as natural entities and ecosystems, our mountains, our deserts, our forests. And so these practices can provide philosophical starting points too. Our language, for instance, embeds knowledge in ways that facilitates and requires philosophical inquiry. Naming practices, for instance, are grounded in detailing relationships, for instance, recognizing those relationships, thinking through how those relationships might have changed and how we embed that knowledge once more in our languages and our words that we use. Socio-environmental practices too are manifested in enactments of connection, grounded in responsibilities to value, to protect, and to further enhance human-environment relationships. So our natural environment and our socio-environmental practices can provide or inspire moments of critical reflection. They can reveal and or reinforce knowledge about the world, and they can teach us how to live well. And so they provide a point within this complex relationship system of relationships that the relationships that Māori and wider Pasifika, but also wider Indigenous philosophies take as basic. A point within that system where we can focus, where we can expand, and where we can really cultivate critical and creative thought. So how does the idea of Kaitiakitanga fit in here? So let's just kind of step back for a second. So Māori philosophy begins with relationships, or whakapapa, what we call whakapapa, the idea that all things are situated within, influenced by, and then also storied in and through this complex system of relationships. And so this idea, this whakapapa, this idea layers and records these relationships and also their interactions, right? Beginning with the creation of the universe and ending only at the very limits of human imagination. And because whakapapa maps the places of connection and separation, can also help to explain the nature and importance of relationships, and it can help us to unpack how distance can be navigated. And so what this means is that whakapapa provides a way to kind of really elucidate the normative significance of relationships by providing a framework to explore the extent to which relationships can be enhanced or diminished. Right? And so provides a range of insights for thinking about how we value relationships and how we can relate well or not. But if we place such a high emphasis on relationships, then processes and practices of relationship regeneration become really critical. Right? And so for this reason, whakapapa is not just a conceptual framework in which to organize our relationships, but it actually determines processes and practices to reinforce and to remake and to reimagine relationships too. And this is one of the places that Kaitiakitanga comes in, right? Kaitiakitanga is an example of a rich and diverse set of socio-environmental practices, usually translated into English as stewardship or guardianship or trusteeship. It indicates the intimate, place-based attachments of a community and then codifies the socio-environmental responsibilities that arise from those connections and the place-based knowledge that that community has. And so of philosophical and practical importance is the way that Kaitiakitanga conceptualizes and maps the distribution of responsibilities to protect and enhance these relationships, human-environment relationships, and how it guides practices through things like norms of care, use restrictions, and also restoration. So these human-environment relationships are of central concern regarding virtually all practices that involve the utilization of any kind of natural entity, any relative, right? Harvesting and hunting, for instance. And then preserving and strengthening these relationships relies on deep place-based knowledge, relevant practical experience, and structures for the intergenerational transfer of both. So there's quite a lot to unpack in this idea of what does it really require of us to be stewards, to be trustees, right? And of course, we also have to take into account that practices and concepts in the complex networks they make up are not static either, right? In the past, Kaitiakitanga and this idea of what it means to be a steward or a trustee had to adapt to different environments to maintain individual and communal flourishing. Right? So our Polynesian ancestors, for instance, we traveled across the Pacific and then through Aotearoa to a quite a different natural environment, a different landscape. And so this required adaptation and responsiveness. In particular, the ability to incorporate new ideas and practical innovations in a new place, to learn from that place, to listen to it, to track its patterns that were new to us. And so this dynamism draws much needed attention to the way in which diverse and transformative practices are really vital for living well at both the level of the individual and the level of the community, especially when they're confronted with change and uncertainty. So what then does Kaitiakitanga require today, and what can it teach us? Well, one of the things I think this idea of trusteeship teaches us is that we need a range of knowledges to meet the challenges that we face and to flourish. We absolutely need scientific knowledge. Right? We need concepts that capture and communicate the environment's more than human value too, though, and that recognize our environment's global intergenerational importance. Need concepts to carry that story, right? That help us to understand what that means. We, of course, need imagination to even motivate a commitment to its protection and care. This is one of the roles that our narratives and stories have, right, in our communities. And of course, we need intimate, place-based or local knowledge that details the changing conditions of specific environmental contexts. So what we find what we beautifully find is that Indigenous and other local knowledges are embedded in and across diverse land and waterscapes, from our mountains to our low-lying atolls, from our densely forested areas to our ice continents, from our vast oceans to our deserts, right? Indigenous and other local knowledges are vital for understanding particular ecological systems and for understanding how communities can thrive within them or not. And so together these knowledges can provide an important line of sight into some of the complex socio-environmental processes on which our planet depends, bringing richness to our understanding of how we can flourish in radically different environments. Indigenous and other knowledges reinforce that our shared future depends on this global epistemic network, if you like, and the communities in which these knowledges are contained and lived still. The Asia-Pacific region alone, for instance, is home to the oldest culture in the world and 2/3 of the world's Indigenous communities, including 3,000 distinct languages and civilizations. And it's within this region that Māori knowledge brings some insights into the diverse land and waterscapes of New Zealand, including the rich and vital knowledges of the worlds that are there, human and non-human, that are there. And so these knowledges embed not just critical scientific observations and historical events, but normative insights also. detailing not just ecological health and human nature interactions in the past, but what living well might look like, should look like in the future. The other thing that I think Kaitiakitanga teaches us, and which I think as trustees we need to be mindful of in doing more, is that we need to recognize that we not just need diverse knowledges, but that we need diverse social practices too. And that's because alongside a range of knowledges, we find diverse social practices all over the world as well. I mean, for one thing, diverse environments necessitate and inspire such things as, diverse languages, social and political arrangements, laws and decision-making structures, systems, right? Our planet's diverse and changing ecosystem helps to demonstrate the way that diverse ecological communities adapt in unique ways to their environment. Something beautiful about that diversity and the way in which we engage with different parts of our landscapes. And so Kaitiakitanga helps to reinforce just how important it is that our social practices are responsive to the ecological context in which we live, and for enabling transformative change too. That we don't just think that one particular way of practicing is the right way, and that we don't allow ourselves to adjust when we need to. Our social practices should reflect our rich and diverse environments. They ought to. They should provide insights into our interactions and help to explain how these interactions shape our collective lives across multiple generations. And that's because Kaitiakitanga not only enables us to subsist, but are also sources of our identity, of our understanding, and our socio-environmental connections, right? Social practices are not only informed by unique ecological systems, but also inspire co-evolving intergenerational human-nature relationships as well, that have a really fundamental role to play in the way in which we live together in human communities. And that's because our social practices, like the story of Tohe that I talked about, the grandfather that was looking for his grandchild, these social practices connect numerous generations, this one act, right, linking us with communities who lived centuries before us and with those who will live in the distant future too. And so what that means is that being a good steward or a trustee or kaitiaki relies on other practices, right? On the recognition of other practices around the world, including those that have evolved over time locally elsewhere and those that regulate our global relationships. It's both local and global after all, right? Mindful of the overlapping ecological relationships in which we collectively live and committed to the building of social relationships to protect them, new practices to protect them if needed. And so these practices operate at both scales, and they're critical to the protection of our diverse local environments and critical to the protection of our communities and critical to the long-term flourishing of our planet. And the final thing that I think Kaitiakitanga teaches us, and what I think good stewards and trustees ought to do, is that they're committed to multi-generationalism, right? So Kaitiakitanga and the pursuit of socio-environmental justice, for instance, requires both knowledge and imagination, right? Not only do we need to know how to pursue and realize things like social justice and ecosystem health, but we also need to be able to imagine relationships and responsibilities far beyond our own temporally and spatially bound lives, right? So for Māori communities, Kaitiakitanga is grounded in this aspiration to leave behind thriving communities, right? It's reflected in the way that we live our individual and collective lives, hopeful that what we value, what we create, what we pursue will in fact endure, right? That there will be a future of some sort. That it's reflected in the way that we challenge and transform policies based in part on the legacies that those policies will chart and enable in the long run, right? And it's grounded in the acceptance that what we leave behind for future generations shapes not just how meaningful their lives will be, but how meaningful our lives can be said to have been as well. So there's a commitment to multi-generationalism, a commitment to pursue projects that span several generations and that will only come to fruition long after we're gone. There's a built-in commitment that you find within Māori and other Indigenous communities to that multi-generational purpose. So Kaitiakitanga builds from and calls then for an environmental ethic, if you like, that embeds in an epistemic infrastructure that recognizes the fundamental role of Indigenous and other local knowledges for pursuing and realizing global change. It calls for an ethic that enables Indigenous and other communities to pursue just and thriving socio-ecological futures through their practices, right, that are embedded in diverse socio-ecological systems and landscapes. Calls for an ethic that cultivates opportunities right now for communities to speak, right, to be heard, to create change, right, in their own way. An ethic that values even the networks of solidarity and multi-generational stewardship that are woven across a range of contexts already, right, recognizing that there is networks of solidarity and multi-generational stewardship operating right now. And finally, it requires an ethic that recognizes that our diverse ecological systems provide a meeting point for the interconnected networks of relationships that constitute our planet. That these ecological systems, our oceans, our bird life, our sea creatures, they provide us with the roots that we need to each other and to a thriving future. That is one of the places that we need to begin. Kia ora mai tatou. Thank you very much from New Zealand.
Wonderful. Thanks. Thanks for the digital claps, everyone. Appreciate that. Really wonderful, Krushil. I'll open it up for questions in a moment. So feel free to get ready to raise your digital hand. I just want to quickly say I always really enjoy listening to you because not only is it your delivery sort of really soothing and almost poetic, I feel like the way you say things is reinforcing the message. But I'm really interested to hear what people have to say. So we'll open it up for questions. So feel free to raise your digital hand, and so we'll have a few minutes of Q&A for Krushil, and then I'll ask questions of both Deborah and Krushil about their more general reflections on Indigenous thought in the academy and in practice. So. Yeah, thanks, Evelyn. Please go ahead. Thanks.
Krushil, I'm wondering if you could say something more about the relationship between local caretaking and our knowledge, our understanding, our living in local environments, and global decision making. And I'm especially thinking about things that have to do with like oceans, other kinds of biodiversity as well. I know that there have been a lot of invasive species in New Zealand, and could you say anything about that relationship between local and global decision making?
Great. Yeah, thanks. So there's a couple of things that I want to say about that. So on the so I tend to think in the work that I do sort of in sort of global kind of decision making on agenda setting with the UN and things like that, what struck me is that there's this really big epistemic gap, right? So everybody at best does this quite well. I think everybody is really keen to kind of acknowledge diverse knowledges. They're really keen to sort of engage with the voices of local communities, particularly Indigenous communities. But I just don't think we have the epistemic infrastructure that allows us to do that yet, right? And that's because we tend to be operating at quite a distance. And I think there's ways in which we can try and figure that out. Where, I mean, just recognizing, right, that we already have this beautiful network of epistemic kind of resources that exist across the world already, that there's something really valuable in that we can learn from that perhaps a global agenda that somehow tries to cultivate and enable that epistemic infrastructure, or that epistemic network rather, is healthy, would be a really great start, right? But I just think we operate in ways that create more distance between the questions that we're asking globally and the kind of the solutions that we can find locally, right? And also we tend to forget as part of this kind of distance or gap in this infrastructure that there's really interesting and important learnings and insights from local communities for these global agendas, right? We don't have a way in which we can kind of speak to that either. On the invasive species thing in New Zealand. So yeah, it's really interesting. So we've written a paper about this. It's so New Zealand has its own quite interesting policies around introduced species, as you might know. But of course, for Māori and other Polynesian communities, the kind of like the movement of different species around the Pacific, for instance, was just kind of what we did, right? So much so that in New Zealand, for instance, we have an island that's the only protected, the only place where an introduced and invasive species is protected anywhere in the world, and that's our kiore, our Pacific rat that's introduced. It was brought over with some of our communities, our Māori communities, and which they value, but which can be very bad for our native bird life. So I think, it's tricky, right? It's kind of, it's this sort of, it's interesting. One thing I want to say about this is that we have this saying in New Zealand, which is ka whawhai tonu mātou ake ake ake, which was the title of a really important book on Māori protest, which means, it's a struggle without end, right? And that kind of can feel like a bit of a downer, but I think that's a really a nice way of thinking about the way in which we have to live together, right? That Indigenous and Māori communities recognize that anything worth fighting for is just a struggle without end, right? The introduction of invasive species and having to kind of navigate and negotiate those relationships all the time, right? It's a struggle, right? To have to kind of figure that out. The fact that we have all these global challenges, these are likely to be struggles without end, right? Otherwise they wouldn't be worth fighting for. So I think, and the link between local and community, it's not going to be something that you get right and that it's just right forever. It's always going to be a struggle without end because it's worth fighting for. So I think that's the thing to remember about all these kinds of challenges and these tragedies that we might be facing. Yeah.
Great. Sorry. Did you want to come back, Evelyn?
No, I just wanted to say thank you.
Great. So next is Simona Capasani, and it's worth saying just quickly that Simona is part of the group that's putting on this Climate Hub series, helping organize it. So yeah, take it away.
Thanks so much, Kian, Krushil, Deborah. It's so great to see you both and to learn from you always and to hear you speaking. So saying hello from this side. Krushil, I was going to try to maybe ask something that probably was jump-started by this last bit and how you were answering Evelyn's question. You mentioned a lot within this kind of, conception of trusteeship that a core feature of living well is dynamism. So I was wondering, because I think a lot about human and non-human mobilities, and there does seems to be, right, this kind of tension that not only humans, right, but non-human species needing to move or needing help to move or wanting or being able to stay in place as a reaction to the kinds of impacts of biodiversity loss, habitat loss, and climate change. But often that means if we keep these kinds of rigid conceptions of what is an invasive and what is an endemic species, right, it might actually resist these kinds of mobilities. So I was wondering, and perhaps you're starting to touch on it, especially within the context of Maori philosophy that also looks at how legacies of colonialism hindered movement, right? If this kind of dynamism is maybe an element that we can bring into thinking about conservation within the context of these new changes, or whether you're able to find that when it comes to like maybe policy conversations around how to assess the changes in local environments.
So is the question whether or not we can build in and whether we ought to build in dynamism into our conversations?
Yeah. Particularly whether that introduces then a contradiction to some extent when it comes to maintaining certain kinds of relationships. So how you find that balance in the adaptation.
Again, it's just struggle without end. But also, it's interesting, right? Because on the one hand, absolutely, there's kind of this need to be kind of open to change and adaptation and dynamism. But then we can't forget, what kind of preempts that, right? And as Deborah was talking about, colonialism, right? I mean, there's the fact that sometimes our practices, we find new ones, right? Or we find that our practices are not the right ones to engage in the environment. But sometimes we lose our practices and we lose our language because of colonialism, right? Because of oppression. And so we have to be really mindful of that too. Yeah, so I think there has to be a role for dynamism. And I think that makes it tricky within this not just colonial oppressive kind of system, but the fact that now we've kind of lost this chance to sort of, I think, listen to the environment in the way that dynamism is actually more organically kind of created, right? That the environment tells you, right, what the right practices are, how you might need to adapt those practices, how you might need to go back to old practices or new ones. There's this kind of space that we're in where it's this kind of forced, kind of manufactured dynamism that I think is problematic, right? So I mean, it's tricky. Yes, we absolutely need dynamism. How we get there requires quite a lot of conversation, engagement with local communities, and also just being mindful of the fact that a lot of this dynamism at the moment is kind of having to be manufactured in the ways that are not in the spirit of Māori philosophies, actually. Right. Yeah.
That's super helpful. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Okay, so let's move to the final part of today's session with both Deborah and Krushil, if you don't mind. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start by asking a couple of questions for our panelists, as it were, and feel free, anyone in the room can type questions into the chat. And after I've asked a couple of questions, if there are questions from the room that might be of interest to hear both of their perspectives, that would be very welcome. I mean, part of why I propose this session is I think that this is a chance for us to get a sense from people who have been in these conversations for a long time, to get a sense of the temperature of those conversations. So a first question is just to sort of level set. In the past 15 years, you come from different academic communities, Deborah more from law, Krushil more from philosophy. In your respective disciplines, how do you feel like, let's go in the same order as the speakers went, how do you think interest in and appreciation of Indigenous environmental perspectives have shifted in the legal and the philosophical discussions? Thanks.
Okay, so I guess I'll start. Thank you, Krushil, for that presentation. Really need to follow up on the well-being conversation. I think there's a lot that I would like to learn there. I would say in in Canada, what you've seen over the last 15 years is this, I guess, shift in the discipline to sort of understand Indigenous legal orders, I guess, or systems. Before that, if Indigenous, anything legal was considered, it was under what we called Aboriginal law, which is like black letter law, like this court case said this about Indigenous rights or whatever. And then a shift over to Indigenous law, which is what are the laws that have been there for thousands of years, and how do they inform how we can govern or make decisions now, how they can be shared with others. Because they were there, like I said, for thousands of years. But one of the views from Indigenous people is those laws are still there. A lot of them, like natural law, comes from the natural world. They're being broken by other people. Because one of the tensions is, and I've been asked this question, is why would you want to bother sharing these, documenting and codifying them with other people? It's like, so that they know what the laws are, so they don't break them anymore. That's the idea. That's the hope, or this continuous struggle. That was pointed out. That was pointed out before. So those Indigenous laws, not like a lot of them are for all kinds of different reasons, like conflict resolutions. Communities are developing child welfare laws, citizenship laws, like other kind of laws based on our own traditions and societies. But in the realm I work in, is the recognition of a lot of the, I guess, natural laws have a kind of environmental orientation to them. So the work at John Burroughs and M.A. Craft and others, like M.A. Craft more in the water realm, John Burroughs more in the kind of land natural resource realm, do incorporate, I would say, the ethics and what those mutual kind of obligations are. That's foundational to Anishinaabe natural law is our obligations, mutual obligations and duties to each other. So it's very relational. So to me, that does get applied in the environmental justice realm. The area that I think they're introducing, I guess, into the broader area of law, what they're calling the non-human, or I guess non-human species or our relatives, bringing that into that realm through maybe the personhood or the rights of nature, which I think is way more advanced in the Maori context and in the Canadian context. That's how they're kind of dealing with it. But I think that introduction is there and those conversations are happening. How that plays out, I'm not exactly sure how that's gonna happen, but to me, at least we're having the conversation. People are saying, oh, there's a non-human world, what they're calling the non-human world, or more than non-human worlds. So I think that's what we're starting to see in the Canadian sort of legal kind of landscape, this thing called Indigenous law. And a lot of the work is to try to document and codify it so that other people can understand it. So that's sort of how that landscape is kind of playing out at the moment. So hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, so what I hear is a move from the black letter case law to recognition of and interest in trying to systematize these norms, practices from Indigenous people and try to figure out how those might apply. Yeah, Krushil, so in philosophy in the past sort of 15 years, what changes have you seen, either good or bad? How would you say things have developed?
Great question. So I was just thinking about this 15 years ago. I was just finishing my PhD, and sort of Indigenous philosophy, at least in philosophy departments, wasn't really something that was being talked about. And that's quite surprising in New Zealand, I think, because especially as Deborah said, there's all these kinds of really innovative laws that are coming out protecting mountains and forested areas and rivers and things like that. There's also quite a lot of work that tries to weave what we call mātauranga Māori knowledge and environmental studies and different kinds of ecological practices. But in philosophy in New Zealand, it's a and I don't know if this is a kind of a general problem in philosophy. I suspect it is. It's a very slow, unmoving space for any other kind of philosophy. Let alone, I mean, we still have departments that don't like particular kind of continental philosophy, and so then they just don't like anything else. So I think it's tricky. I think if you want to work in this kind of space, and you want to work. There's lots of reasons why this is problematic, of course, in philosophy, because it means that you exclude a whole range of practices of philosophical inquiry. You exclude lots of kind of grounded and engaged forms of philosophy. There's a whole range of ways in which we just kind of limit ourselves and our departments when we do this. And so it just means that like wonderful Indigenous philosophers like Kyle White end up just doing their work outside of philosophy, right? Their wonderful philosophical work, because there's no space in philosophy departments still for this work, right? Even if they hire someone who can do Indigenous philosophy, they will limit the practices that you can engage in. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in the discipline of philosophy. But I think one of the wonderful things of Indigenous philosophy, which I write about, is that these are the philosophies that are lived in our communities. So it's okay if the discipline of philosophy is slow, and if it can't hold us, our communities where our philosophy lives, they're fine, right? And we can work there. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Krushil. I mean, I like to think that a space like this in the American Philosophical Association, which like right in the center of the discipline, is hopefully a way of trying to claim a little bit of space. But the other thing is just look at all of the people who have tuned in, and some of these people are some of these Zoom boxes represent groups of people, right? Colleges, bunches of students that have tuned in as watch parties. So that suggests that there's a lot of interest, and I like to think that really means that whether or not there is appreciation in all corners of the discipline, that there are lots of people who are interested in these discussions. So I wanted to get a chance to really for you to brag about your various successes, because both of you have had very significant. So what I wanted to ask is sort of what challenges or successes have you had bringing attention to Indigenous worldviews, attitudes in your disciplines, or in the context of discussing with decision makers and policies and changing institutions. So challenges both in the sense of what ways have you found people to be hidebound or uninterested in engaging on the sort of negative side, but on the positive side, what have you found that have been messages that have resonated in particular ways, and what kind of successes have you had? I know both of you have interacted with lots of different kinds of stakeholders and institutions, so I'd be interested in hearing about either of those kinds of experiences. Maybe we'll go in the same order, and then I've got a question in the chat which I want to ask you.
Okay, I'll try to be quick because there's a lot to say there, so that we can hear from Krushil as well. I think I talked about what some of the challenges are, but I think in my very first climate change meeting that I was invited to, it was sort of like, hey, you should go to this meeting. It was the Council of Academics trying to decide what climate priorities are that they wanted to tell the government of Canada. First of all, they weren't expecting me, because my name, Deborah McGregor, doesn't indicate what you see in the little box at all. So I walk into the room, and the first thing they're doing is like, can I help you? Like, why are you here? And I'm like, but my name's right over there. I'm actually supposed to be in this meeting. So they weren't expecting that. And then I was bringing up these weird concepts of colonialism, how that interferes with our ability to be able to, or maybe our climate change priorities are different than the ones that they were proposing. And so that felt very unwelcoming because they were hardcore scientists whirling around in their chair. We don't know how that's relevant, like being so aggressive. And so there was a couple of things I realized. One is I'm dealing with people who know nothing about the history and challenges Indigenous peoples have faced. And I wasn't there to do Indigenous Studies 101, but I was stuck doing Indigenous Studies 101 when I didn't feel like I could contribute the knowledge that I was actually there to contribute. Fortunately, there were other people there who got it, so I didn't have to totally carry that burden myself. But they felt reluctant. Well, we shouldn't be speaking on behalf of Indigenous peoples. The other thing that I found, and it took me a while to figure this out, I kind of figured it out a little bit later, was initially the desktop, research that this group did was it put the impact on Indigenous peoples and their rights and livelihoods was like in the top 5. We had to identify the top 6. So this is what the people's actual research showed in the Canadian context. We had to do these weird little computery kind of ranking the academics around the table. That went way down the list. It was no longer important by the people that were around that table. And the kind of solutions that people were proposing, even though the research had showed this, the people's opinions that around this table did not. And this was going to be some report going to government to say what priorities should be. What I realized what some of the solutions were was very much oriented to protecting property and basically a capitalist way of life. There was no interest in Indigenous way of life and livelihood and what that meant. And then I started to realize that climate change, mitigation, adaptation, solutions is geared towards protecting people's property. Let's build this great big wall to prevent the flood from coming, or rising sea levels, or whatever. It wasn't about people's actual life or livelihood. And I realized, so it was a very kind of cynical start. And that's when I realized they really need to hear from Indigenous peoples and others. And generally, and that's also when I had the aha moment. Again, it took me kind of a while to realize, when I was in a few more conversations, that people didn't ask the right questions 4 decades ago. They didn't think about that. They were so techno focused, like, let's continue this unsustainable life that produces carbon, which they're focused on, and have these techno type solutions rather than really look at the values and what we valued. So So in terms of successes, I think for some reason I continue to get invited to these spaces. I thought I never would again. They may not be the same space because I would say these crazy things, the other C words that people didn't like or know what to do with. But I think there's more interest in it, and being able to bring forward that people experience, everyone experiences climate change, but not in the way that we study it. We experience it, I guess you could say, holistically, like our lived experience of climate change. But the disciplines and how they study it don't study it the way people actually experience it. I'll stop there because I like to hear from Krushil as well. Anyway, crazy story. I don't know why I'm still in this space, but there you go.
So that's great. So I'm hearing on the one hand this idea that, look, when you first came into these spaces, these people just had no understanding of the basics of Indigenous life and the challenges. So there was nothing to work with, and then you ended up having to stick to these basics when you really wanted to give your points. And then there's this other idea that I guess. Yeah. Anyway, let me stop there and pass it over to Krushil.
Yeah, I mean, everything that Deborah said, obviously, I mean, I think there's quite a lot of translation work that we have to do, that we continually have to do, right? And that's just because of the way in which we're still teaching all of the things that we're teaching, economics in particular. So for instance, working with Treasury here in New Zealand, there's so much good intention, right, to try and figure things out, but there's just the tools, there's just no tools to do that yet. And we're still teaching using the same tools, right? And so we just keep developing the same kinds of people. So I think it kind of leads to, one, there's this kind of comfort with this distance between the work that you do, right? If whatever you're doing, right, as a scientist or economist or even as a philosopher, and the communities that you're actually talking about or that you're affecting, right? There's that, which Indigenous scholars just do not have, right? We just do not engage with that distance. We always have to kind of reduce in our work. But the other thing I think that is lacking is just this lack of imagination, right? To sort of think about a different way of doing things, to think about kind of being outside of the discipline as you understand it, thinking about how different knowledges might be situated, just being unsettled a little bit. I think there's just an unwillingness and a lack of imagination for how to do that well. And I think there's a role for philosophy in trying to push us, right, to the edges, right, of human experience and towards new ways of imagining how we can work together. I think that is one of the jobs of philosophy, and I would think we need to do that more.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I definitely agree. I think philosophy as a discipline is about questioning our assumptions, and if we're not doing that, then in some sense we're not doing proper philosophy. And there's lots of different kinds of assumptions to question, and sometimes those bring us to uncomfortable places. So what I wanted to do was I'm going to pose the two questions that are in the chat, and you're welcome to take either or both as you want. So the first question is from Jan Dekkers, and Jan asks about So I'll say those, and then you're welcome to close. We'll be booted off soon, I think. So the first one is that especially in sustainability context and environmental context, vegetarianism and veganism are really big topics. So the question is, how does that fit is there space for those kinds of discussions in the Indigenous cosmologies that you're familiar with? How would that fit or not fit? So that's one. And then the second is, maybe the suggestion is one role for Indigenous philosophy as we change these sort of structures is to do it as public philosophy. Is that a way that you've had success or you could see being successful? So we're going to wrap up and just sort of 4 minutes so maybe a couple minutes each, if that's all right.
Did you want to start this one, Krushil? I feel like I've been taking up too much space here. Yeah.
So there is a group of Māori vegans actually, which you can look up. They write about that. I mean, I think one thing to remember is that within, say, Māori philosophy, everything is on the table, right? I mean, there's possibilities for everything, because it might be, for instance, so we have a concept called rahui, which is prohibitions. There's a universe, right? There's a world where prohibitions on all meat eating, right, is not okay, right, because of the conditions in which we're living. So it depends on how you're cashing that out, right, on whether or not you're talking about managing relationships and cultivating good relationships, right, or whether you're having a kind of an outright sort of a rahui that just can never end, which would go against the idea of rahui, which is always a temporary prohibition. So it depends on what you mean, but there's always this kind of having to kind of negotiate how we live our lives, right? There's also, I mean, lots of work written by wonderful Indigenous North American scholars, right, that talk about hunting practices and doing that well, right, and doing that in a way that honors relationships. So there's more to just the practice of eating, right? There's so much more to that story that you need to fill in as well. On public philosophy, what was the question? Sorry, I missed it.
So do we think that Indigenous philosophy might fit into the sort of boundaries of philosophy as a sort of form of public philosophy, I think?
I mean, I think all philosophy needs to see itself as a form of public philosophy, if I'm understanding you correctly. I think more philosophers need to engage in public philosophy now more than ever. We need to have the courage to do that and to be willing to learn how to do that well, right? So yeah, absolutely.
I don't have anything to add. I agree with everything that was said. It's great. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, then let's close out. So thanks so much, Deborah and Krushil. Thanks to all of you for attending. The turnout is really excellent. Appreciate all of your time and your thoughts and your contributions. And it just leaves me to say thanks and hope to see you all again in various spaces. Really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are in the world. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
See ya. Bye.
Bye. Ciao.
Have a good day.